Welcome to the Wealth and Purpose podcast, where people who are led by their hearts come to learn the secrets to creating wealth in a way that feels really good and live their purpose fully in the process. I'm your host, Patty Lennon. I'm an ex-type A corporate banker turned intuitive business coach. I'm also a wife, a mom to 2 preteens, a professor, Girl Scout leader, and well, hey, you get it. Like you, I wear a lot of hats. Whether you're looking for inspiration to get started or strategies to get growing, I am here to help you create abundance in every area of your life and business. Welcome. Hey there, this is Patty Lennon, your host. I'm so happy that you've chosen to spend this time with me on this episode of the Wealth and Purpose podcast. Today, talking about something that has been on my heart for so many reasons, and that's the topic of civil discourse. A lot of what I share here tends to lean towards topics that I think if you were to just listen to what I speak about, you would assume that I am a liberal, let's say, or a Democrat. And these are all terms that in the States signify, a certain type of person. Maybe you would call it more progressive. Lots of names go around. But the truth is that I'm a pretty firm moderate, and I grew up as a right-wing conservative. I did shift my position as I got older, but as a young person, probably into my early 20s, I was very much a right-wing conservative. And I share that because it's possible that on this podcast and podcasts going forward, maybe things that you pick up from me may seem out of place if you sort of are putting me in the category of a liberal. And one of the things that was the most important to me as a young person, as a high schooler in college and in my early 20s, was to have conversations around things that were going on in the world, whether it was politics or religion or, any number of things. I was blessed to go to a all-girls Catholic high school where the teachers, although they were nuns, I shouldn't say although, that were nuns, were highly educated nuns. And they really valued thought and thought process. We weren't taught, and also because there were only girls or women in the school, there was really no idea that, a girl or a woman should be quiet, right? Almost all our teachers were women. Having strong discourse about topics were really important. Now, I will say, it was probably easier for me because I was a right-wing conservative that maybe if I had more liberal ideas, that outspokenness wouldn't have been as encouraged. But it certainly was in my school. And then it was at my home. And this came to light for me because I've been having a really big ache in my heart missing my father. So my father died last year. He died suddenly, although he was almost 90 years old. And I don't know that I quite grieved him the way that I did my mother last year. The world became very busy for me. My kids were older. One thing led to the other, and I was the executrix of his estate. And so there were a lot of things to do around his death. And so maybe because of isolation, maybe because of the state of the world and particularly our country, or maybe just the fact that his birthday is in a couple of days and Father's Day is coming up, I'm just feeling deeply the loss of him in my life. And I think one of the things that's alive for me is just how he really taught me to engage in civil discourse. And by civil discourse, I mean the discussion of ideas. I'm sure I could look up a definition that probably would be more accurate. But to me, it's to be able to discuss things, exchange ideas, maybe of opposing viewpoints in a reasonable way, without screaming and ranting at each other in the way that I'm seeing happen on social media. When I was younger, and my dad and I shared sort of similar ideas, being both right-wing conservatives, the way we thought about them was different. And, we get into heated debates. heated debates. And that as my ideas grew more progressive and I moved away from that right-wing perspective and certainly the conservative perspective, our debates got even more heated, to the point that my mom used to leave the table crying, because that's usually where our conversations happen, was at the table, whether I was living at home or not, right, after dinner. And as I was reflecting on this and thinking about my father and missing him so much, because right now his ideas about what's going on in the world, especially around the issues of race and racism, would probably be somewhat different than mine. He was not an outwardly or an aggressively racist person, but he would have struggled with some of the ideas of systemic racism. It would be hard for him to wrap his head around it, although we'd be able to discuss it. And he would probably shift some views along the way. But what he'd also bring to me is another perspective. And I really don't have, as I looked out across the rainbow of people that I have in my life, anyone that I would consider a right-wing conservative has been showing up in a very toxic way. I don't see, and this goes across the board. I don't pinpoint just right-wing conservatives, but even my most, I have plenty of liberal friends and all the way across the spectrum that are showing up in very toxic ways in the way they're speaking to each other right now. But where I miss my father is I also have friends who are, who can have discourse on these ideas, but none that really fall into that right-wing conservative, the one that I always struggle to understand the most. And yet my father could always help me see it, not necessarily agree with the viewpoint, but at least show me a lens that helped me understand better. And in that understanding, we could talk to each other and share ideas. And, sometimes he shifted me and sometimes I shifted him. And sometimes we stayed in our separate camps, but with a better understanding of each other and where each other's coming from. And so my dad, when I was growing up, could be really hard on me around some things and definitely was responsible for some of my wounds around perfectionism. And, as we grew, both of us grew up and he grew older, he softened a lot. And a lot of those wounds between us were healed. And yet some of that stuff stuck around. And I always sort of grouped the way that we used to have those intense debates, especially when I was young, because we did it from when I was probably 9, 10 years old. I always attributed it to the same camp of him being so hard on me. But when I looked back recently, as I reflected on our lives together, what I realized is even at 9, he treated me as an equal in conversation. He might have gotten heated in a way that I necessarily would probably be horrified by if someone was talking to my child that way. And I'm sure explains why my mom left the table crying. But he never talked down to me. He never treated me like I was less than him because my ideas were different than him. And through that, he taught me the art of civil discourse. And as I've gotten older, I've really utilized that understanding, that deep understanding to not make someone less than because they are different in their ideas. And right now, what I see, and it's a natural instinct, the more fear grows, the more likely we are to become polarized and to say, I'm here and you're over there, and either you're over there on a different team or you're here and you're on my team, but there's no middle ground. And if you're on the other team, whatever the other team is, then I'm going to see you as a threat. And I think that's what's changed is through social media, through increased fear, through lack of in-person communication. I honestly don't know what exactly has caused this, but somewhere along the way, we've lost the ability to hold separate ideas and yet retain respect for each other. And I think we're losing out along the way in losing that ability. And unfortunately, technology that allows us to communicate without seeing the other person and without feeling their response and really understanding the nuance that comes with in-person communication, civil discourse is disappearing. And over the last 2 weeks, especially as topics of race and racism and becoming anti-racist have become really in the forefront of my mind, but I think in the forefront of at least the US and perhaps beyond that, the world, is the need to find this space for civil discourse and to bring understanding to conversations. Because if we don't find that, we won't understand each other. And the reality is that there's a lot of people who are not going to instantly change their mind, right? Most people don't instantly change their mind. When we're adults, after we've grown past the point of, learning ages, which I'm forgetting now what it was, but I think it's 21 or 23. At that point, we basically our thinking is kind of solid. Like we've categorized everything and everything has to fit into an existing category. And in order for us to change and grow in our thinking, we have to come to understand. It's a slower process. It's not the same as when we were kids. And we have to give each other some time for that. Without it, we end up existing in a world with people that we may have, if we were in person with them, come to a place where we could at least respect where they're coming from or understand. And from that understanding, maybe share ideas that will change their mind, that will open their hearts, will open their understanding. But this way that we talk to each other and, just want to eviscerate sometimes people, almost as if watching Facebook, I don't know, and even Instagram, I found it to be even worse. It was almost that, it was some kind of horrible game where the goal was to just take people down as opposed to change their minds. And with my father, because he was so important to me, that wasn't an option, right? And as I got older and life got more complicated, really beating him at a debate became even less and less interesting. And gaining common ground and understanding became much more important to me. And so I had all of these decades to play with this and to grow in this. And I realized I was lucky. I don't think it was a unique circumstance. First of all, my father and I are built the same. And the circumstances of my childhood into my adulthood and my father's lent themselves to us being on this constant journey of learning and growing and understanding how to let someone have a different opinion and respect them. And in the case of my father, love him. So I know I come to the table maybe with me a little bit different lens around this. But I can tell you, if you're out there and you're kind of looking into the conversation and thinking, what is this? And where do I play a role? And how does this work? And can I just get away from it? And yet not wanting to be silent necessarily. I can tell you that most of the good information comes from listening, finding new ideas and new ways to think about things. And just opening to the possibility that an idea you held firm on last week maybe isn't right for you anymore. Just starting there. I've been doing that, consuming new information about anti-racism and becoming anti-racist. And how do I do that? And things are shifting inside of me. And some of it is hard. It is hard. But the saying goes on the reverse for maybe someone who's holding ideas that looked on the outside that maybe they're mean or wrong or even evil. And I'm not precluding that some people just are that angry and stuck in fear that not everyone's gonna change. I get that. But if we can make space to even pull conversations offline and have civil discourse, invest in someone to have a conversation, someone who thinks differently than you, a lot of good can come from that. And that's where my focus has been. I've been mostly quiet on social media because as I see conversations popping up, including people I know that have good hearts, that are saying things that to me, or I would say to many, would look like they're not getting it. I'm taking those conversations offline. I'm investing in those conversations. And the thing is, those conversations are hard. They require an intimacy and a vulnerability that social media doesn't have. But it's exactly those qualities, that intimacy and vulnerability, that create the space for people to see things differently. What I know for sure is that no one changes their mind because someone is nasty to them on social media. No one changes their mind because someone screams at them in all caps. People change their mind because something opens their heart to new information. One of the main things that, my father and I never talked about or avoided, I avoided it at least, was the topic of abortion. And because he was a firm pro-lifer. And I knew that. And I also knew that there wasn't a lot of value in us having that conversation because our worlds were so significantly different that I wasn't sure that there was a middle ground to have there. And it didn't come up organically. If it had, I might have considered it. And having been a pro-lifer until I was about, 25, I also understand his view. And I know from where he comes from that it would be pretty hard for him to shift his perspective. But something happened about 3 months before he died. Something in me changed. And I felt so compelled to have this conversation with him and help him understand why I felt that abortion should be legal. And this was really, really difficult ground for us to cover. And I knew it was going to be. And I honestly, at the time, have no idea why I felt so compelled to have that conversation with him, knowing that he had only a handful of years left. And as it turns out, just a couple of months. And in that conversation, as we discussed it, it went exactly how I expected it to go, not how I wanted it to go. And, he resisted. And, his position is that all life is precious, that life is, that life starts at conception. And where I had shifted my beliefs and where I moved away from the pro-life positioning that I had held was that I never changed the belief that life started at conception. What happened was, as I learned more about the law, and I was super passionate about the law, I was pre-law in college. As I learned more about it, I started to realize that my belief that life began at conception was a belief of faith. And it wasn't scientifically proven. And that was really what helped shift my viewpoint, along with working in pro-life organizations and really starting to understand that the actual way that the work played out in the world didn't represent the values that I thought it did. But that came from being in engagement with it, right? In a way that actually my father never was. And so as we talked more, what I shared with him was that, 3 women who were girls of, friends of mine growing up had abortions. And I wasn't going to tell him who they were. I told him, I'm not going to tell you who they are, but I want you to think back, Dad, over those years that I was growing up. Think back on all my close girlfriends and all their parents. And can you honestly tell me that you know for certain that none of those girls I grew up with would have been beaten, would have been disowned if they had a baby? And he stopped and he got very uncomfortable. And I think this was why I had always avoided this particular conversation, because something started to bloom in his eyes, a notion I could see something was shifting inside of him. And it was fueled by pain, and pain that came from love. Because my dad was always so loving to all my friends. He loved every single one of them. And as he contemplated those families, I knew ahead of time, I knew already he'd know There was no way he could say that about all my friends' parents. They were good people too, but they were a certain type of person, and most likely they would have either beaten their daughter or disowned her. Not all of them. And for him to consider that and suddenly feel it land within him, I saw something shift inside of him. Now, I think it probably would have been another many years, if he ever changed his position on legalizing abortion. I doubt I ever would have. But what he said when he finally did speak was, I just didn't realize. At the time, as I said, I wasn't sure why I even brought that conversation up, because I knew I would have to bring to him some level of pain for him to truly understand why this was so important. And now, for the time that we're in and the care that I'm taking with the conversations I'm having with people who have different ideas than I do, especially right-wing conservatives who, are built a certain way like my father, and bringing that care is, I think I had that conversation. Maybe some part of me knew I needed to have the information that the most difficult and painful topics can be looked at if it starts with the goal of understanding and also mutual respect and care for the person that you're speaking to being a fellow human. Now, maybe every person I'm talking to, in fact, I know every person I'm talking to right now, and in this way, I don't love them as much as my father. I'm not going to take care of them the same way I would with my father, but I do love them. And I think we have to bring some of that into our conversations. The firm respect, the goal of understanding, to create a platform to move forward from, and to really create a discipline of civil discourse in this country. Now, I want to be clear. This is not me saying that I'm against protests. I'm not saying that I'm against any form of activism. That's not it at all. It's just that when we're communicating with each other on social media or in any other form, or truly our goal of putting words out into the world is to change someone's mind, we have to look at the platform of civil discourse to do it. And let me just say, I'm going to just raise my hand that there were a few people that I know that I don't necessarily love. I just happen to be connected with them on social media who have always sort of rubbed me the wrong way. And they put out things and that people objected to, and they got pounced on and really just torn up with comments. And I will admit, at first, I was looking at it and sort of enjoying it. I'm ashamed to say that. Well, maybe not ashamed, but I'm a little embarrassed to say that because, I know better. But my instinct was to be like, yeah, you've been putting this stuff out there and people are seeing through you now. And I did my work on that. And I came to a place. It took me about 3 days of that. And then I finally realized what I was doing. And I came back to this place of compassion, of understanding that everyone's just doing the best they can with what they have. A lot of people have very little that they work with from an internal resource standpoint. So if you're listening to this and you've been out there and you've been sort of screaming at people on social media or judging them or resenting them or whatever it is, I get it, right? I am certainly not perfect in that arena, but I'm just going to ask you to, really kind of think about why. Why is that, why is that the way that this is going about your communication, and how is your communication affecting others? Like, what is it that you want to achieve? Do you just want to be heard, or do you want to actually create change? Because change doesn't come by yelling at each other. And certainly if you're on the receiving end of it and you've been like avoiding social media because it's overwhelming and it's hard, I get it. And that's a fair choice. You have to protect your mental health. Just understand, a single conversation with a single person with a different viewpoint can create tremendous shifts, put big ripples in the world. And for those of you who have ever taken the time in helping to change my mind or bring me understanding on where you're coming from, I just want to say thank you. We may not have agreed, but I do appreciate your willingness to invest in me that way. My dad's birthday is on Friday, and Father's Day is coming. And if you are one of those listeners that's been following since the day that he died, and you know what that journey has looked like, and you would like to do something kind of in memory of him just by listening to this podcast, pick one person that has a different viewpoint from you and see if you can start a conversation with them based on civil discourse. You will honor his memory tremendously. And beyond that, you will start a ripple that has a very positive effect in the world, I promise you. Have an amazing day. Hey, thanks for listening. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, please share this podcast with them. And if you're feeling really generous, I'd love for you to leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. It helps us reach many more people, and it fills my heart with so much joy when I hear what you had to say about what you heard. I am cheering for your success. Have an amazing day.